welcome to this London Art Week conversation about the Metropolitan Museum's exhibition Why Born Enslaved? Fictions of Emancipation, which is centered around Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux's Why Born Enslaved? My name is Emanuela Tarizzo, and I'm a member of the board of London Art Week. And with me today is Elyse Nelson, who is assistant curator in the Department of European Decorative Arts and Sculpture at the Metropolitan Museum and co-curator of the exhibition. The exhibition itself runs until March 2023, so if you have a chance, absolutely visit. And the bust at the center of the exhibition was first modeled by Carpeaux in 1868 and produced in marble, plaster, terracotta and bronze versions from 1869 onwards. And Carpeaux developed it from studies for the allegorical figure of Africa in the central group for his Fountain of the Observatory in Paris. We're going to hear more about the development of the work by Carpeaux from Elyse. But to begin, I think, Elyse, could you tell us about the genesis of the exhibition? And if Francesca, you can show on screen some of the shots from the installation itself. And we can talk a bit about, also the title of the exhibition, the word fictions in it.
Sure. First, thank you so much, Emanuela, for inviting me to have this conversation. It's really my privilege to be here. To jump right in, the genesis of the exhibition, I would say actually began in 2018 before I joined the Met in my interview when I proposed an exhibition that would focus on questions of representation as it pertains to the depiction of Black figures in the European Sculpture and Decorative Arts Department's collection. At this point, the idea was broad and sort of nebulous, but focused around the Cordier lacquer press in our collection, as well as the terracotta version of Why Born Enslaved, which you see on your screen here, which was already in our collection. And it wasn't until a few months after joining the department in 2019, when Sarah Lawrence, who was the new department head, made her first acquisition with the marble version of Why Born Enslaved. It was at that point that the object became really the focus of an exhibition. I spent the next several months as I was researching for the acquisition. I engaged in in-depth research around the bust and felt that it was a really compelling sort of linchpin for our narrative, not just because it was a new acquisition, but because of the ways in which this bust compresses the entangled histories of 19th century histories of slavery and abolition, of colonialism, of Enlightenment theories of ethnography, of capitalism and sculpture's relationship to industry through its reproduction. This is a really compelling and complex object, and I felt like unpacking that would allow us greater insight into this work of art, which has always been a bit of a riddle within the art historical canon. People always scratch their heads and say, but why did he make this in 1868, 20 years after the abolition of slavery, and what does this mean? And so I wanted to solve that riddle, not solve it, but address it. But also, it just seems that this bust really captures so many of the complexities and what we perceive as contradictions from that moment. Mm-hmm. So I sort of, for the next many months, was working on this exhibition concept, and once it was approved, which is a long process at the Met, I then reached out to Wendy S. Walters, who's a professor at Columbia University and the head of the nonfiction writing program, and asked her if she would be interested in joining me in co-curating the exhibition. And Wendy and I had worked together previously. When we first acquired the bust, she wrote this really extraordinary poem called In the Gallery in response to the bust. And so I understood her perspective. I understood also her really in-depth knowledge of the histories of colonialism and representation, and also really valued her perspective as a writer who brought a very different voice to this project. And So she and I then kind of set forth on to craft an interpretation, one that would be deeply responsible to the traumatic histories of slavery and colonialism. And we engaged, a number of different groups and collaborators throughout the process, which I think Emanuela and I will discuss later. But one of the key decisions that we made in working on this was the title, to get to that question, and the use of the word fictions in the title of the show. It was a really lengthy process to decide on a title. But I think, first of all, what that word is intended to connote is that the works of art in this exhibition, like all works of art, are constructed. They are images or symbols that were created, and as such, there are different influences that come to bear on the constructed object or image, such as the perspective or priorities of the maker, the perspective, desires, or expectations of the patron, the commissioner, or the audience, the intended audience. Works of art are not these things that occur naturally in the world. They're always constructed objects. They are works of art, they are fictions. And if we acknowledge that, then we should also acknowledge the things that shape them directly. They're makers in the worlds their makers live in. So part of sort of deconstructing an image is acknowledging that it is always a fabrication. I think fictions also points to the idea that works of art in this exhibition represent, again, not objective truths, but realities that are often partial truths or ideological concepts, or in many ways they obscure histories, histories that are not told. A lot of emancipatory work or artwork that represents abolition or emancipation is highly fraught. And we wanted to acknowledge that pretty directly in the title of the show, so that it was clear, in order to sort of build trust with an audience, that this wasn't an exhibition that was merely just celebrating abolitionist art as such, but rather interrogating what that means and art's relationship to a history of slavery and abolition. And I think, finally, fictions points, directly to the contradictions that are embodied in Why Born Enslaved. This is a work of art that carries an anti-slavery message, in principle, but simultaneously visualizes racial violence and inequality through its depiction of the Black female as bound, as subjugated, as eroticized, and as an ethnographic type. And this contradiction is not unique to Why Born Enslaved. It's really at the very heart of a history where, from our lens, it's very tempting to understand the abolition of slavery as something that was confronting and moving against the history of colonialism. But the more research we did and the more we learned about the history of the abolition of slavery in France, the more we realized it really aligned with and coincided with an escalation in colonialism and new colonial enterprises. And so it is therefore very much intended, the way in which this work of art captures both a celebration of abolition and a very colonial perspective is really true and representative of the moment in which Carpeaux is working, where that was
Can I
was
just
kind of what was
ask
there.
to have the slides back to the exhibition views? Sorry, Francesca, thank you. We're going. No, that's fine.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. I was just seeing the slides going a bit all over the place, so I just thought I'd stop you. And in just going back to the idea of fictions of emancipation, and as you've described, that there are fictions within these works of art, stories that we sort of were crafted. And one of the fictions, I think, is already within the title itself, Why Born Enslaved, with which implies that, there is an assumption, a fiction, that, to be a free person, a person of color had to be born enslaved in the first place. Why born enslaved? And I think this is obviously incredibly problematic. And you were just elaborating on that, but it's, it's not only about, freedom from enslavement as labor. There's different types of enslavement. And I think there's a lot that one can discuss and see in this work of art.
Right. I think that one thing we see in the exhibition and in the history of representation of Black figures in European and really Western art is that the Western imagination and Western artists struggle to represent Black personhood without it being tied to a history of slavery and the kind of vestiges of slavery. To speak to the point you just raised, which we discussed in the introduction of the book, Black people did not need to be enslaved first in order to be free. And to represent Black personhood is simply to represent Black people as they are in their social roles. And there was, because the institution of slavery was of such a magnitude, so all-encompassing, so unfathomably large, I think what we see in European art quite clearly is that Blackness and slavery become entangled and sort of intertwined, and there is a struggle or a refusal to represent sort of Black personhood in many instances.
I mean, the definition, when the bust was exhibited in 1869 at the Salon, and then it was purchased by Napoleon the third for Empress Eugenie. But it was exhibited with the title Négresse, which is the female in French for Negro, which is obviously a pejorative term and was already at the time, and it was used as a synonym for slave as well at the time, so, which in and of itself, I think, exactly proves the point you've just made. The exhibition includes a number of works from the 18th century that sort of explore the abolitionist art and the representation of abolition and slavery in art at the time. And so to what extent would Carpeaux have known of, for example, the Wedgewood anti-slavery medallion that you see on the screen and other sort of precedents? And how would they have informed his work of art? We have in the following slide, which we can show in a minute, there's a bust by, and the following, sorry, there's works by Jean-Antoine Hudong, who is a very famous French sculptor. So if you can talk to us a bit about that context, so to speak.
Sure. I mean, Carpeaux, one of the fascinating things about this bust is how he is drawing on so many different reference points and so many art historical tropes and traditions. And he was absolutely, I think, influenced by the popularity of the Wedgewood medallion. It was discussed at length in the planning process of the exhibition, to what extent do we bring in the British history in discussing Carpeaux's bust. And I just want to say up front that, of course, the abolition of slavery in different countries and different empires at different moments throughout the 19th century are all very specific histories. And there should not be treated as, a same or similar history. That said, we do see this certain imagery really crossing transnational lines and becoming quite influential kind of universally. And that history begins with the Wedgewood anti-slavery medallion created in 1787 by Wedgewood, who was, of course, an entrepreneurial potter, but also an abolitionist. And he creates this at his own expense and disseminates probably thousands of them to supporters of the movement to sort of campaign for abolition. And it's small scale, kind of inexpensive. He made it at his own expense, therefore easy to sort of really disseminate and get the word out. And the success of this was so great that this image became the emblem not only of the British anti-slavery movement, but also the French anti-slavery movement, and then was used in the American context as well. And so I included on this slide the image of the Amis des Noirs, one of their pamphlets, abolitionist pamphlets, where you can see it's being used. And then a whole kind of cottage industry emerges where this image is being transferred onto all different kinds of domestic wares and jewelry. So you have, it imprinted, encrusted into this cologne bottle, and it really becomes such a famous image. And if you move to the next slide, please. And we see in Carpeaux's creative process that one of the sketches he makes for Why Born Enslaved, while he's creating his fountain figure and working on Why Born Enslaved, it's impossible to say whether this is a sketch for one or the other. It's really part of the same creative process at this point, but he creates this kneeling figure, really a substantial terracotta sketch of it. And this work is so informative of, our perspective on the bust. Why are her shoulders hunched forward in the bust? That's because her arms are bound behind her back. And while the front arm is truncated, the back arm is fully intact and behind her back. Why is she looking over her shoulder, kind of tossing her head over her shoulder and looking upward? That is because she's crying out, why born enslaved to, master or some power above her. So of course, I think Carpeaux is thinking very much about Wedgewood. I think he's also thinking about the longer tradition of the ways in which non-Europeans and Black figures in particular were often depicted on fountains such as the Taka fountain, and in kind of Black more kind of furniture as
the Taka fountain. Sorry, just to sort of give a little bit of context, the Taka fountain that you see on the left on the screen in Livorno in Italy, commissioned by the Medici Grand Dukes, and the 4 bronze figures around the base are considered, the 4 Moors. And I think there's definitely a visual, with the hunched shoulders and the kneeling poses, there's an incredible similarity there for sure.
Yeah. So I think he's drawing on his sort of, Rolodex of art historical references of how is the Black figure depicted, and what are the ways in which it's been depicted, and how will he then create, and craft his emblem of, a protest against slavery with this object. If you could go to the next slide.
Yeah, and so here we have the Hudong, so closer to home in a sense for Carpeaux, a French example. And if you want to tell us a bit about this, but also then moving on to, within the French context, the abolition of slavery had taken place in 1848. So 20 years before Carpeaux first models Why Born Enslaved. And so if you can tell us about the factors that would have influenced him to create this bust, which he then repeated in several versions, which is really interesting. So, but let's start with the Hudong as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is just one more kind of influential work that is an absolute precedent to Carpeaux, is that in the 1790s, Hudong creates this bust, which was actually the model for a fountain figure he had made a decade earlier, a fountain that represented a servant who was pouring water over a white bather in a large kind of fountain piece, and that piece was vandalized during the French Revolution. But Hudong had in his studio the kind of model for this, and in 1794, having had been sort of criticized for not demonstrating his support as the Enlightenment sculptor of his time, and not demonstrating his support for the abolition of slavery, he takes that bust, that model off the shelf, which is famously depicted in the Boilly painting, and transforms it into a sort of abolitionist image by inscribing on its base or its sokol a statement commemorating the recent abolition of slavery. And so the context here is, of course, that slavery was abolished twice in France. First in 1794 during the French Revolution. It was then reinstated by Napoleon I and abolished a second time in 1848. So this work is a very clear precedent to Carpeaux. It is a Black woman depicted in the bust format with an inscription on the sokol, and also that he created in miniature. So on the right, you have the original bust in its full scale, which in the 20th century, the bust was damaged during a bombing of Soissons. So, but on the left, we see a miniature version where it's still intact. So he created these sort of miniatures to sell and sort of promote the.
There is definitely a sort of commercial sort of opportunism in a sense, both in Carpeaux and in Hudong and in others, which I think leads well into what I to ask about. What were the social factors that led Carpeaux to?
Yeah, I think one of the social factors was certainly that abolition in 1794, as it was then later, became a source of national pride at a moment when nations were kind of defining their statehood. Abolition was something they held up as a virtue, and this was definitely the case in France. You can go, if you could move the slide forward, please. This is the to state the other kind of underlying influence of Carpeaux, which is Michelangelo, of course, the kind of tossing of her head over the shoulder, this dynamic movement, imbuing the figure with, human pathos. Carpeaux is definitely drawing on this, but one more slide, please. This is just an object included in the show that was probably a sketch submitted in 1848 for an open call for monuments to represent the new republic. And we see Marianne standing, triumphantly with her arm raised, wearing the Phrygian cap and Grecian robes and stomping on the chains of slavery. And then this Black emaciated figure kind of helplessly leaning on her for support. And the kind of attitude that is embodied in this work, I think, was really prevalent, that abolition was a French virtue and was really a source of pride and the result of French benevolence and of their values. And so in 1868, it's 20 years after the abolition of slavery has taken place. Why is Carpeaux revisiting this? If you could move the slide forward, please. One thing that's happening in Paris in the 1860s is the World Fair, which takes place in 1867. We have, dozens of different nations showing all of their, goods and products, and it's a massive display of national and colonial power and might. And on view are a number of abolitionist objects. In the American section, Ward's Freedman is on display. That's included in the exhibition. In the French section, Cordier's Love One Another is on display. Carpeaux makes his work just 1 year later after this display of works where the 1867 Universal Exhibition is really interesting because there is a lot of sort of an immense sense of pride and empire. And so there is a celebration of a kind of multiculturalism that is really colonialism, a huge display of Algerian goods. And so the image of the Black figure is really prevalent, as is imagery representing abolition. And so I think Carpeaux, as somebody who was really had his finger on the pulse of what was popular among a large kind of bourgeois art buying audience, understood the kind of this moment and the opportunity this moment presented. He has just been commissioned, if you move the slide forward one time, to create the central sculpture for the Fountain of the Observatory, as Emanuela described earlier. He's working on the figure of Africa, and while he's doing this, this is a commission that takes many years to complete. It's very expensive, very labor intensive. And something that Carpeaux had begun to do was that while he was working on these really time and labor and resource intensive projects, he would extract certain narrative elements and sell them as individual works of art. So while he's working on the figure of Africa, he sort of takes, the figure, the model who posed for the allegorical figure of Africa, then he also creates this independent work of art that he can sell. So to speak to your comment about sort of opportunism, I think he understands that there's a moment where abolition is on people's minds as a source of cultural and national pride, as a source of kind of one-upsmanship. Also, the French were deeply invested in the American abolition for varying reasons. And so this becomes, again, a kind of popular subject at this moment. And so he's thinking about his audience. But I also think, lastly, he's thinking about Napoleon III, the emperor, who indirectly commissions this. It's a state or city commission for the fountain. And of course, this is a fountain of the four parts of the world. It represents the strength of empire, and Paris is the center of the world. It's commissioned in the same year that the World Fair is up. This is about, France's relationship to the rest of the world, and it centers Paris as the, center of an expanding
centrality to it, of course.
Yeah. But he, at this stage of Carpeaux's career, he is very invested in the emperor's perspective. He is seeking favor from the emperor. He has just received his first, commission to create the empress's portrait. And the emperor's perspective and his own are really one and the same. And he would not have created this work if he thought that it was subversive or dangerous. And rather, I think he was really had the emperor and a broader audience in mind, and understood the popularity of this subject matter. And the emperor is somebody who had never really supported the abolition of slavery, and was not a progressive in that sense. However, after the defeat of the South and the American Civil War, which was a real blow to his empire, they were his gateway to Mexico. He relied on the cotton coming out of the South to fuel the French economy. And also, the end of slavery in the United States was really the end of the transatlantic slave trade altogether, or slavery and the Atlantic world altogether, which was not really what he was in favor of. And so, but at this moment, after 1865, he is at the end of the empire. He sees he's losing political power, losing favor with an increasingly kind of liberal Republican sentiment that's rising in France. And so he embraces this. It's one of sort of many gestures he makes toward the end of the empire to embrace a more kind of liberal stance. So he buys a version of it for the Empress's collection, and she was known to collect art that would kind of express her values, her political values. So I think the work is about all of these things.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's also another element, perhaps, that might have definitely, I think, informed Carpeaux and his, thinking about the probable success of this composition, is ethnographic sculpture at the time, sort of French ethnographic sculpture. And by that, I mean that the fact that there was from actually the 1840s onwards, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, there was a close connection between sculpture and ethnography, with ethnography sort of being seen as a way to draw sculpture closer to science and to objective observation. And this obviously is also incredibly problematic and incorrect. But, I'm thinking about the works by Cordier and Bartholdi in your exhibition. Cordier was basically seen as the master of ethnographic sculpture at the time. So how did Carpeaux sort of bridge naturalism and allegory in his bust? And, what issues arise with this, his decisions?
I think this sculpture wouldn't exist without Cordier's work preceding it. He draws so much on the influence of Cordier. If you could switch to the next slide, please. And that history begins in 1848 when Cordier presents this bust made after Said and Cass at the Paris Salon, and 1848 being the year that slavery is abolished throughout the French colonies. And immediately upon its debut, the bust was embraced as this extraordinary anti-slavery symbol. And so why is that? It's because he is individualized, he's sort of humanized, he looks beautiful and dignified. This is a really kind of dignified format and a formal bust created. And we have to imagine, previously Black figures were considered chattel, not human. So to depict a Black figure as human was a statement, and a noble one. And so this bust was embraced for all of these reasons. That said, I think we have to be quite careful about what we mean when we talk about sort of humanized depictions. Because this bust, for instance, was never, we know who posed for it. If you could go to the next slide, his name was Said and Cass, and he was a Sudanese man from Darfur who was formerly enslaved, and after his emancipation moves to Paris. He models for a number of artists, including Cordier. But this bust was never presented as a portrait of Said and Cass. Instead, it was given different names, such as Said Abdallah, a name that would associate him with North African Muslim populations, and then later as Nek de Timbuktu, an entirely different region of Africa. And so what I'm wanting to illustrate here is the fact that naturalism is not an indication of truth always. And this is one of the major, I think, sources of confusion in sculpture at this moment, that the more naturalistic something looks, the more we want to believe that it is factual and it is accurate, right? But naturalism is a style, just like abstraction is a style.
It's a vocabulary.
It's a vocabulary, and it can be used for any different purpose. And at this moment, we have the field of ethnography, which has been taking shape for 100 years, but has really come to a kind of apex. And we have Cordier, an immensely talented artist who is articulating those ideas visually in his works of art. And I think something I want to emphasize is that well, what is ethnography? You know, ethnography is a system of ordering humankind based on their physical attributes. So categorizing humans based on their skin color, their facial features, their hair texture, and the implied that physical characteristics are then associated with internal characteristics such as morality and intelligence and capabilities. And it's a kind of matrix system for creating a hierarchy of humans. And so it has incredibly sort of dangerous implications. And those that hierarchy can then be, that typological approach to humans can be reinforced by works of art that depict humans as, you know, types. And so what sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, no, just it can be used for different agendas as well.
Of course, yeah. So if you could go to the next slide. So why Born Enslaved, like other works by Cordier, is incredibly lifelike. It's naturalistic in its appearance, and it was modeled after an individual. So that's the naturalism. That said, these works can still carry messages and have sort of, you know, ideologies that are sort of embedded in them. And in that sense, I think that we have to, you know, it's important to acknowledge the ways in which ethnographic sculpture is not, you know, truthful. It is as much allegory as anything else, because it's connoting a value system and creating that value system. This is a work, for instance, by Cordier, where we have this incredibly, beautiful lifelike figure who is represented draped in exquisite marble onyx, and that onyx has been extracted from Algeria. And so she's literally kind of wearing, the sumptuous robes of empire, and in that sense is very much a trophy. So one could ask, is this, naturalism, or is this allegory? It's all of those things.
And is it a celebration of the individual, as it is sort of purported to be, or is it a celebration of the empire as well? As you said, there's these very strong signifiers in the material in this case as well, material coming from Algeria, which was a French colony.
And this, I think, leads into what we were thinking about discussing next, which is, you said, a celebration of the individual. What individual is represented here, and is she represented as individual, or is she represented as a type?
And the title is indicative of that as well, I guess.
It is. In fact, the same woman who posed for Why Born Enslaved is thought to have posed for this work. That is based on a document of the Cordier family stating that fact, and many art historians have questioned whether that could be true, because Why Born Enslaved and this work appear so different and don't look too much alike. But what I would say in response to that is that they're not portraits. You could have the same person modeling for two works of art, but if those works are being imbued with different values and different end goals, who's to say they might look alike, because they're not intended to represent that person as she exists in the world, but rather to use her likeness to create a symbol or
a fiction or emancipation. But speaking about the sitter, it's actually the next point I wanted to ask you about, because you as you just said, Why Born Enslaved is not a portrait. It does have this sense of incredible truth, being incredibly true to life, and it looks like an accurate portrait, but we don't know who sat for it. We have no records of the name of the sitter. What was the studio practice at the time? What do we know about Carpeaux modeling this bust, and why is it important? And probably next slide.
So we know that a woman posed for, if you could go to the next slide, please. We know that a woman posed for Why Born Enslaved. We don't know who that woman is exactly. We know she was present, and we know from the Cordier family it may have been the same woman who posed for his bust. To have models in the studio who would pose for works of art was common practice in the 19th century. This is not unusual. And many models were nameless. Their identities were not always recorded. They were kind of low-wage workers whose identity is not necessarily part of the work of art as the artist intends it, as part of the artist's conceit. Their likeness, their bodies are being sort of used to create whatever the artist is sort of after. And so when we talk about portraiture, a work of art can be a portrait whether or not we know who the sitter is. And I think the question of portraiture is, does it represent that person as they are in the world, as they want to be represented, or even as they don't want to be represented, but in a certain social roles? What we know about Why Born Enslaved is that Carpeaux was using the likeness of a person to create a symbol and an image that would really transcend an individual and exist on the level of symbolism and a typology. And so the work is not about her. Of course, the person who would have posed for him in year 1868 would have been free. And so any portrait of that person would have represented her in some other manner. He's making a specific choice here. And this was incredibly common. And of course, if he's working along the lines of ethnographic sculpture, none of these were portraits of individuals. They were all representing types, representing Black figures as a type of person. And therein lies, the problem. We do speculate in the exhibition and in the book about who the woman who posed for Carpeaux may have been. And there's been incredible work done by Denise Morel and the team at Musée d'Orsay with the Modèle Noir exhibition to identify sitters. And that's a really important history. And so we wanted to make an effort to, if we could, find anything about the woman who posed. We were not very successful in that endeavor. We did find this photograph of a woman named Louise Cooling, and the dates, and I think her likeness sort of make a kind of somewhat compelling case, but without further documentary proof. Louise Cooling was 35 at the time this photograph was taken of her. She was from the United States, Virginia, was brought over by a French man and was, made to pose for the series of ethnographic studies. And so we have her both straight on and in profile. And the dates of this are so similar to when Carpeaux is working and Cordier is working, that one wonders if it's the same woman who posed. Also, that her profile, there is a resemblance there. And so, but like I said, I was not able to find more information. I had an incredible graduate intern named Rachel Hunter-Heim. She's a PhD student at Columbia who did so much research to try and sort of verify this, and we were unable for all the reasons that are to be expected. There's so little documentation of Black people working in Paris at the time. So, but that said, the exhibition's not really about the woman who posed for Carpeaux, but rather what he's doing with
the image. Created.
And I think that distinction is really important.
And moving on to the exhibition, I think to the exhibition itself and your curatorial choices, you, as I mentioned in the introduction, this bust was produced in several versions from 1869 onwards, and the Met already owned a terracotta version of it when you then purchased the marble, and both are in the show. So can you discuss a bit about this choice and what informed your decision to display both?
Sure. If we could go to the next slide, please. So it's correct, we have two versions. Sorry, one more. Two versions of Why Born Enslaved in the Met's collection. The marble is incredibly rare. There are only two marble versions ever made. One was the original Salon marble that's now in Copenhagen, and then our version, which was carved in 1873. But Carpeaux created this work, as I mentioned, the kind of commercial intentions from the beginning, always with, its replication in mind. And he replicated it in many different media: plaster, terracotta, bronze. And the decision to have two at the center of the exhibition rather than one was to, it worked on many levels. First of all, the subtitle of the show is Carpeaux Recast. And we are thinking about the ways in which this was a commercial popular image. And it is because the work has been recast and remade that it is really so immensely famous and popular today. This is how the work has come into the collections of many museums in Europe and the United States, and also has become really part of popular culture. There's a version of it in a Beyonce video. Janet Jackson owns a version that was illustrated in Architectural Digest. You can buy candle miniature reductions from Cire Prud'homme. I mean, this is a work that is everywhere, and that has to do with Carpeaux being an artist who was commercially reproducing this work both during his lifetime, and then that reproduction continued after. And so the exhibition is, that commercial impulse, I think, is really essential to sort of grapple with. What does it mean to reproduce, to buy and sell images of an enslaved Black woman in the post-emancipation period. And what does it mean when the slave, when this is something that Wendy, my co-curator, always talks about. It's interesting that after the slavery is abolished and the buying and selling of Black bodies ends, then the buying and selling of representations of them begins. And so we wanted to sort of grapple with that. I will also say sculpture, the fact that we had these two busts, I felt really strongly that, I wanted this to be a really powerful sculpture show that really emphasizes this medium and the way in which the sculpture plays a very specific role in the history of representation of abolition and emancipation, because it's a medium of public monuments and all of this, but also that it has its own aesthetic qualities, and it's really dynamic and powerful to have two versions of it back to back at different angles and for you to walk around it. And conceptually, one thing I had in mind in suggesting that type of design was that when you walk in, you're confronted with this bust from the front and from the back. We're asking you from the very beginning to look at this from a number of different angles and to reconsider, your current understanding or pre-existing understanding of the work of art. So that's how it was sort of, that was the concept behind the decision. And also that this work, there's not one prime work, but rather that the composition sits at the center and the exhibition kind of unfurls around it in this kind of centrifugal way, and that also, that concept, resonated with that. That's how the show is organized. And so we're giving you a kind of visual cue that as you experience different sections of the exhibition, you look back at the work at the center.
And speaking about the exhibition and the different works that you've exhibited, I mean, we've talked about works that preceded Carpeaux's own work and works that were contemporary to his bust, to his Why Born Enslaved, but then you've also shown works by American artists and contemporary and American contemporary artists. So, and I think there's maybe in the next slide, we have a...
Yeah, one more. So we included 4 works by American artists in the exhibition, all for very specific reasons. The Freedman on the left, I already described, is a really important work for Carpeaux. He would have seen it at the World Fair in 1867. And it, it represents a freedman, but still has his sort of shackles, and he's not yet standing, but sitting and about to stand. So represents this idea of fictions of emancipation really, really powerfully. But the other American work that we included in the exhibition is this incredible piece by Edmonia Lewis. She is the only, female Black and Native American artist represented in the show. Her work is singular and represents very much a kind of counterpoint to Carpeaux's bust in many ways. It's extraordinary that she was sculpting at the same time Carpeaux was, that she could create a work like this, which was not given a commission and was never bought during her lifetime. She was at the time living in Rome, and she also went to Paris in 1867 to see the World Fair. So there's this really close sort of connection between these artists and a dialogue in terms of, their visual vocabulary and themes at this moment. But she goes back to Rome then and finishes this work called Forever Free. And it's, the Black man notably is no longer kneeling in shackles or seated, but standing kind of heroically, triumphantly, holding in his left hand the broken shackle. The implied narrative here being that he broke it, that he had, his own agency and in his freedom. The female is notably still kneeling, and one can speculate a lot about, the reasons for which Edmonia Lewis would have done that. But I think certainly the work anticipates the differences men and women, Black men and women, would have in their freedom. So the inclusion of her, given that it's sort of self-representation and really, I think, drives home the differences and again, the constructed image of, who makes it, who are their commissioners and audience. She was doing something very brave and very, very different at a moment, while still quoting from different, Western sources and visual imagery at the same time. So those were two works that were included. And then finally, contemporary works by Kara Walker and Kehinde Wiley. Kara Walker's piece is a mold taken of a contemporary bust, a contemporary replica of Why Born Enslaved. I mentioned that it continued to be reproduced, continues to this day to be reproduced. And so she took a mold and has this incredible sort of inverse, ghostly image where instead of having, the wholeness of the bust, we have a hollowed out negative of it that sort of stares back at you. And it's just a brilliant work that I think speaks to absence and histories that are lost. And it felt like a really vital inclusion. I mean, I think the question of when to include contemporary art, if ever in a historic exhibition, is something I thought very carefully about. But Wendy and I really felt that to not include a work that was created a few years ago that responds directly to Carpeaux's work would be an exclusion in a way, because it speaks to the ways in which the legacies of that type of imagery are still so relevant and being responded to critically by artists.
And I think contemporary or otherwise, this show is very much about responses and dialogue between works of art. So no, completely. And I don't know if you want to talk about the Kehinde Wiley as well. We are sort of getting closer to, we still have another 5-10 minutes.
Sure. We can flip to the Kehinde Wiley, but we should probably kind of move to sort of questions or our last.
Yes, but in the meantime, if we can see the last slide, please. Yeah.
So this is included in it as well, and it's a really small, it's a small work, a surprising work to many people by Kehinde Wiley. But I think he's thinking about commerce in a way very similar to Carpeaux, and it's made from cast marble dust, which I find absolutely fascinating. In the same way that Kara Walker is using sort of a plaster mold, the working material of sculptural reproduction, he's using kind of working material, the throwaway of sculptural production, and kind of congealing it into an image in a way that I think is a pretty powerful metaphor.
And so there's one question about, and just sort of to say, if anybody has any questions, you can type them into the Q&A box. We already have a couple. The first one, I think there's a question about the issue of translating the title. So from the French into, your English translation. And we know that, so that the French title is inscribed on the socle with 1 or 2 exclamation marks. So if you want to. Yes,
that question is from Adrian Childs, and I just want to say hi, Adrian. Adrian was one of the writers for the book and wrote a fantastic essay, and she was very collaborative throughout all of it, and her scholarship very, very influential. But so yeah, I mean, so the way in which we translate, there's no perfect translation from Pourquoi naître esclave into English. I think perhaps the most accurate would be why be born a slave. Mm-hmm. But that is not a phrase we would use in English, why be born. So often you hear why born a slave. We chose to translate it why born enslaved, which, because there's a missing article, why be born slave, in the French, enslaved felt like actually a really good translation. I think translation is a very actually kind of philosophical and very, very intellectual project of are you being accurate word by word? Are you getting at the meaning of it? And so it is a subjective decision ultimately, but we did why born enslaved, also because enslaved acknowledges that slavery is a there's a power structure. A person is not born a slave naturally, they are enslaved.
There's an act of enslavement.
There's an act, and there's an oppressor and an enslaver. And to go back to your question at the beginning, Emanuela, about slavery is not just a system about labor, it's also a system about sex and forced birth, and in order to kind of perpetuate the system. Anyway, but yeah, we translated it in that way. I wouldn't say it's the definitive translation. I'm sure other people will have other solutions, but that is how that's how we thought about it.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's great with, again, it gives a sense of really the exhibition being about reconsidering. And and I should also say I have the catalogue here with me. It's absolutely wonderful. So I think we put a link to the UK distributor of the catalogue in our sort of page about the webinar. So absolutely, if anybody wants to have a look, the essays are absolutely fantastic. The last question is, what kind of assumptions and sources predicated your deconstruction, interrogation, and analysis to produce a sustainable story? So I think maybe should we start with the, assumptions, if any, and sources that helped your.
So I think assumptions. One thing I will say is that it's pretty clear that a lot of assumptions have been brought to this bust. Yeah. Previously, including assumptions about Carpeaux's his own politics. Mm-hmm. And part of the work in, putting on this exhibition was to revisit that question. Was Carpeaux an abolitionist? Was he openly supportive? What was his relationship to power? What was his relationship to the politics of slavery? And without making assumptions on our part, we did that work. Mm-hmm. And what we found was that, he, unlike Cordier, who wrote all about his, opinions on slavery and was really a kind of vocal proponent of abolition, Carpeaux never wrote anything about that. And so what information we did have available to us then was Carpeaux's very clear relationship to power. And then if you interrogate the perspective on power, you can or the perspectives of the state, and what were the prerogatives of the state, you can then deduce the ways in which this work was operating within that context. Sources, we had so many. First, I will say written sources. There is a rich art historical literature around this material that has existed and predates this exhibition, has always been there, and not always, but within the last 30 years is robust. And one thing I would venture to say is that this exhibition doesn't present any new ideas per se. It's really indebted to the work of art historians, the majority of them being Black art historians, many of whom we were so privileged to collaborate with on the book, and on convening and on the symposium. Writers for the book include Adrian Childs, James Smalls, Iris Moon, Caitlin Beach, Rachel Hunter Himes, Wendy, and myself. We had a convening of scholars about a year before the exhibition opened who were major sources of just a wealth of information. And when we were kind of workshopping ideas for the exhibition, they undoubtedly helped us sort of craft a perspective that we felt would be true to history, and also provide a lens that would allow people to appreciate this work beyond just its technical mastery, but its complex relationship to the history of colonialism and slavery. So I mean, the sources were many that we drew on.
And you really drew together different aspects of the conversation that one can have on this bus. As you said, it's not just about the technical brilliance, although that is considered, because you do consider the studio practice of Carpeaux, and his work as a sculptor, the origins of this work within his production, but then also how it exists within the sort of wider framework of ethnographic sculpture and sculpture, and the sort of abolitionist discourse in sculpture. So I think we are perfectly on time, almost. And thank you so much, Elyse, for your contribution. I mean, it's been absolutely wonderful to hear about everything that's come to inform this exhibition. As I said, it's on until March 2023, so by all means visit if you can. And thank you to everyone who's joined us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emanuela, and everybody at London Art Week, and to the audience. It's been a pleasure.